Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ed Aladal from the Kuan Yew School, and I'm happy to welcome you to the evening talk. Many years ago, 4 years ago, even 3 years ago, when we started this lecture series, we only had the lunchtime lecture series, but we noticed there's a lot of people who wants to come to the school and give a talk. So today, we have about almost every day. Not just every day, we have in the morning, lunchtime, and in the evening. So this is the evening version. We run about 400 of these talks every year for all sorts of topics. And tonight we are very happy to welcome the school, Dr. Parag Khanna, to talk about Singapore and info state of the future. Just a little bit about Dr. Khanna. He is a director of the Hybrid Reality Institute. I'm intrigued by what you do, hybrid reality. If there's a hybrid reality, then there must be a organic reality or other forms of reality. He's a senior research fellow at the New American Foundation, visiting research fellow at the London School of Economics, and I can go on with his affiliations. More importantly, he's the author of Hybrid Reality, on human technology and civilization, which was published this year. Another book, The Second World, Empires and Influence in the New World Order, 2008. And the third one is How to Run the World, Charting a Course to the Next Renaissance. Okay, so these are very light topics for Thursday afternoon. And he will summarize all of these three books to us in 45 minutes or less. And he's been featured in a lot of magazines, and I can go on and on here. And he mentioned one thing. He has traveled to more than 100 countries in the world. We'll ask you questions later on about that travel. So over to you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Should I use this, or should I just use the microphone? No. Great. Is it on? Okay. Well, it's not that big a room.
Okay. So, and the most recent country I went to is North Korea. So you can ask me questions about that as well. If you haven't spent a week there, I recommend it, believe it or not. You know, things you never thought you'd hear yourself say when you leave North Korea. I ate too much. I'm just totally stuffed. I have to go on a diet. And number two is I should have come in low season. There's just too many tourists because there are 4,000 tourists a year there now. And the third thing is, wow, I'm really gonna miss this place. So it'll surprise you in multiple ways if you go to North Korea. North Korea is not an info state, which is what I'm going to talk about tonight. I am going to try and capture a whole lot of different themes that have accrued in my mind and in my work over the last 7-8 years, you know, and sort of try and paint some kind of an evolutionary direction to all of this. And I thought I would outline this in 4 ways, because I did want to, on the one hand, be global and also be Singapore-centric in this talk, and particularly being here at the school. So I'm going to talk about situating Singapore, trying to define would be a strong word, I would say, for the kind of descriptive approach I'm taking to this notion of the info state. Some foreign policy talk about Singapore, and then some of the internal issues that one faces here in this particular category of info state. So let's start with situating Singapore, and I don't mean that quite yet geographically, though I will in a few slides from now. But I wanted to first talk about where we stand in this sort of phase of globalization that we're in. And I believe that this is clearly a very controversial issue at the moment. Every day, not a day goes by when you don't hear someone saying globalization is falling, is going into tailspin, is going to reverse, retrench, all of these things as if it's really coming to an end. And I think that's a very misguided analysis, and it kind of rests on this idea that a slowing of globalization equals a reversal of globalization. But in fact, you have to view these things, I think, in a big picture sort of context, and this is how I explain it. You know, what we think of as modern globalization in terms of ritualized or regular growing pattern of interaction across different geographies and regions goes back at least 1,000 years. It actually goes back a lot further. If you just think about human migratory patterns, you could go back 60,000 years. Well, let's just start with the Silk Road era of about 1,000 years ago, thinking about European explorers and voyagers like Marco Polo, or Arabs like Ibn Battuta, creating, you know, leveraging the Silk Road, moving east to west, trading goods and so forth. This is the first sort of regular and more or less uninterrupted transcontinental trading system that we can easily trace back to. Again, you could go back earlier, but there were, of course, great interruptions to this period of globalization, such as the Black Death, right? But subsequently, in the second phase of globalization, and you can almost define these phases to some extent by the technologies that enabled them. When you think about colonialism and the rise, of course, of sea navigation technologies and so forth that allowed, the compass, of course, and so forth, that allowed European empires to discover, quote unquote, the New World, and round the capes and create a global colonial hierarchy. This, in a way, was a second major wave or phase of globalization. Outward expansion, leveraging certain technologies of the era, creating a hierarchy, a system, as it were. In a third phase of the Industrial Revolution, of course, the steamship and rail conferred or allowed the advantages to accrue to particularly Great Britain, Northern European powers, and also, of course, the industrialized United States. And here you, again, perpetuate or deepen in a way the global mercantile hierarchy centered around the West. We only started using the word globalization, as you know, in the mid-20th century, around the 1950s. And here, this was still an era, this modern globalization, post-war globalization, particularly fueled by global industrial growth and the post-war economic institutions, Bretton Woods bodies, and so forth. But still, up through the past, really up until a decade ago, about 15 countries controlled the lion's share of the world's economy, manufacturing, investment, production, and so forth. And here even I put China and India in so-called emerging markets that began to sort of be taken much more seriously, obviously in the 70s, 80s, and so on. But still the world economy was very hierarchical. And what's notable here is not just the countries that are shaded, because of course I should include Australia, but what's absent, right? In conversations about globalization, up until very recently, you could completely neglect to mention Latin America or Africa. Oops. Right? But today, we don't do that anymore. When we talk about globalization, we actually treat it like a global phenomenon, which it actually, finally, in some ways is. So far from reversing, we're actually entering, for the first time perhaps, an era in which all regions, continents, geographies are participating in globalization. By no means equally, but they are participating. And of course, there's a new set of technologies that is enabling and accelerating this. So when you hear someone say the recession is going to throw globalization into reverse, whatever recession we're experiencing now is not as bad as the Black Death and not as bad as World War I. Globalization does carry on. And this is this long arc of where it has brought us to this day, and I don't think it can be so easily reversed. It has a very accelerated impact on all sorts of other trends, most fundamentally geopolitical patterns. In the 1990s, for those of you who were in the geopolitical discourse then, I'm guessing you weren't in the red T-shirt. But in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was this phrase, which you might remember, the unipolar moment. The idea that, of course, there was just one central power in the global hierarchy, the United States. Other regional powers had to revolve their relations around the United States. And this was projected to last for a long time. The research and rhetoric around a peer competitor to the United States cited perhaps the year 2020, 2025, when China's rise might be of some significance. Of course, things have happened a lot faster than anyone sitting in the Pentagon believed in the early 1990s. And so I believe in a very short amount of time, we've moved into a diagram of global order that looks a lot more like this. And there are several things that I'm trying to capture with this image. The first is, obviously, there is no flag at the center of this picture. I think we are moving increasingly towards what some call either a multipolar or a non-polar world. I prefer multipolar to non-polar, though it's multipolar with certain, obviously, aspects of non-hierarchy, and hence it's both at the same time. The second thing is regions. I think one of the greatest errors and oversights in international relations, theory and analysis in the last decades is the broad neglect of regionalism. And there's this notion that sort of we jump from the nation state to the international or global level without taking into account regions. But if there is one very tangible, palpable, economic, diplomatic, and strategic trend, the last 20 years, it's absolutely the rise and growing depth of regional institutions, regional diplomacy, regional trade. And in every single one of these circles, you can actually see it happening in various dimensions. Right here in this region, ASEAN, ASEAN plus 3, ASEAN Regional Forum, East Asian Community, right? The alphabet soup goes on and on. European Union, obviously. And by the way, within Asia, of course, since 2005, there's more trade within Asia than outside Asia, right? Hence, Asian trade has taken on a greater weight, whereas institutions like APEC have been diminished. Even in Latin America, one talks about a union of South American nations, Africa, African Union, and so on and so on. So I think that pattern has been largely neglected. There are still within regions, obviously, power hierarchies, anchor states, if you will. United States, obviously Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and so on. So that is also captured here. But I think most importantly is this phenomenon that derives from globalization in its most neutral definition, which is anyone can deal with anyone. Right? Globalization was almost synonymous with Americanization up through the 1990s, and now it's reached an inflection point where there's an Asian globalization, you have a whole sector devoted to it here, an Arab globalization, a Brazilian globalization, an Indian globalization, and so on and so on. And the fact is that any two regions of the world now conduct direct relations with each other. There's a connectivity in trade and finance, strategy, military relations, and so forth that is unmediated by any one particular authority. And I think that is a central feature of this world that we're moving into. So I think this is why and how the diagram of power has shifted so much. And again, what's in the economic domain, what has been called South-South trade used to be a very meager phenomenon, right? Trade and investment across emerging markets, southern hemispheric countries. China-India trade used to be something like $5 or $10 billion. Now it's $75 billion. The total volume of global South-South trade was, in my research back in 2005, was $50 billion. But now it's $50 billion is about, I guess, one Hu Jintao trip to Africa with a plane load of, business executives, right? So the volumes are all up. And if you believe that globalization is going to reverse just because the UK economy is in bad shape or the American economy, you would have to still explain to me why it is that flights from Sao Paulo to Angola, are full. And why, again, Sino-African trade is growing and Sino-Indian trade, cross-emerging market trade. You would have to be unbelievably Eurocentric, in other words, to argue that globalization as a whole is going to reverse just because the West is not driving globalization. Because again, connectivity across any two geographies is globalization. And it is, by all measures, or has been growing tremendously across emerging markets. So all of that is what I try and capture here. The growing kind of, the diffusion of commercial prowess alongside economic growth is I try to capture here. I took the Fortune 100 of last year, and this is a list that, as you can imagine, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, would have been entirely skewed towards the left-hand side here with North American and European companies. What can I do about this?
We can just remove it and just...
Would anyone mind? Does that do anything?
No,
Okay,
it's
great.
fine. Yeah.
So, but now, of course, you can see a growing range of firms represented here from Asia. The list is growing and growing. There's not a single Indian company as of yet in the Fortune 100, but I think many people believe that that is obviously a statistic that's likely to change soon. So this growing, again, distribution of economic power is this sort of phenomenon. And of course, multinational corporations, whether they are Western or from Asia, depend very much on globalization for their profits. Now, another driver, I'm kind of jumping through some issues and leaving off lots of slides that I could to provide yet more data on some of the economic trends, just to, again, finish this part about situating Singapore and situating our context today. And that is that we're not just in a geopolitical age anymore. Right? For literally since the late 19th century, when the term geopolitique was sort of coined, through the late 20th century, when geoeconomics rose up as a discipline with 5 or 6 centers devoted to that term around the world, I think we're entering this age of geotechnology. And in fact, we've never not been in a geotechnological age. It's just that social science people with geopolitical backgrounds haven't exactly been economists. Economists haven't, almost no one in social sciences has really had an adequate grasp of technology, and we haven't completed this triangle. But today, if you think about what drives power, economic growth, and even military potential, it's of course capturing leading edge technology. So what I'm arguing here is not to substitute one discipline with another, but to take a holistic view that thinks about economic patterns and power, geopolitical, as well as technological, and look at those as three different patterns of diffusion that can aggregate in different geographies to produce greater power concentration. So the geotechnology is certainly a driver of multipolarity. And there's one simple illustration. How many people know the size of China's nuclear arsenal? How many nuclear weapons do they have? That's more than usual. How many?
Roughly 300.
Right, and how many did they have 20 years ago? Roughly 300. Exactly, right. So 20 years ago, did you call China a superpower? So what's made the difference?
Economics.
Right, so, and what is the foundation of their economic power?
Free market.
Manufacturing, right? So manufacturing is a very simple technology, isn't it? But China today isn't just manufacturing anymore, is it? It's looking at a wide range of technological clusters, investing heavily in those, attempting to subsidize, commercialize, produce national champions in those sectors. That is going to potentially increase its trade surplus even more, and those become surpluses that can be reinvested into military and so forth, right? So China's rise is obviously a consequence of a simple capturing of manufacturing, becoming the world's factory floor, and so forth. And now it wants to capture other technologies as well. So this triangle is extremely important to appreciate the role of technology in making China a superpower today, whereas almost the negligibility of the size of its nuclear arsenal. Talk about the quality of the arsenal for sure. But I use this as a simple illustration of the importance of bringing in the technology factor. The shrinking of space, what we call the death of distance, is also obviously a technological phenomenon. Convergence of economies, the research is getting better on the role or the accelerating role that ICT and other technologies play as a component of economic growth rates. Spread of innovation, which I'll talk about in a second, and new forms of collaboration as well. We're moving into a world that is characterized not only by traditional multilateral patterns of interaction, but also public-private partnerships and corporate alliances, where technology is a great facilitator of these new kinds of patterns of interaction amongst authorities. This is what I mean by the technological diffusion. Now, in technology discourse, or even in popular thinking, the word technology is almost always synonymous with the internet and ICT. That's a huge mistake. The leading sector approach to geopolitics stresses a range of technology clusters in any given area that actually ultimately shape who holds power through innovation in the system at any given time. And IT is one of those, but as you well know, people call the 21st century the bio century because of the growing importance of the life sciences, biological innovation, genetics, and so forth, and the profitability in these disciplines. Nanotechnology, alternative energy, I've listed 4, but there's 7 or 8, robotics, artificial intelligence. There's a wide range of economic sectors that are crucial, and a map of innovation and leadership in these sectors 10 or 15 years ago would not feature China, India, Singapore, or other countries. It would be largely concentrated in the OECD world, North America, Europe, Japan. So we see this diffusion of innovation happening, and you see some countries not lit up just because of the way that the data is assembled. Of course, Brazil, for example, is a huge investor in agricultural productivity and increasingly alternative energy, but because it's not a huge component of their GDP, it's not lit up here green, but it obviously is a big player in that regard. But the broader thrust you can sympathize with being in Singapore, that there's an effort to move or gain advantage in some of these leading technological areas and not be a follower anymore. Another part of the context is, of course, the cities, and the power shift is also cities. The top 40 cities, according to McKinsey, in the world economy today, largely concentrated in the West, those representing a total of about a third of the world economy. And then when you plot the top 40 by population size and growth rate, you see that they're largely in the East and the South. And that too, urbanization, where technology, urbanization, economic infrastructure investment come together, you're obviously seeing that as a big driver of growth. I also, there's a growing literature on this idea that, the city-state, and obviously this is a precursor to now getting into the info-state, Cities matter more than countries. For anyone who's just wrote an article at the Pearl River Delta region, 7 cities in southern China would as an aggregate belong in the G20. And that's just one of several urban clusters within China that I've mapped out here. But literally the physical fusion of cities, because they're getting so big. All you have to do is go to Tokyo, Osaka to know that. My favorite one is Abu Dhabi, Dubai are becoming Abu Zubai. Because even 2 cities that used to be separated by 100 kilometers of desert are gradually, you see more and more construction and development along that corridor as well. So urban clusterization is another phenomenon. Now how do we geographically locate Singapore in this? This is a map of existing and proposed. The yellow ones are the proposed. So you can see there's still a long way to go, but high-speed rail networks across Eurasia. And I have a long essay about this in the Atlantic Monthly on their website coming out in September. What would the geopolitics of Eurasia look like in 2025 if China's high-speed rail plans are all implemented? In other words, if you could get on a train in Beijing and it'd be in London 2 days later. Because that's actually, the British Telegraph actually had this whole article about that. Reading that is what got me onto this. Not to mention going across a lot of these places by road and really wishing I were on a train. But Singapore, which we think of, of course, as an island, as a sort of maritime culture historically, is actually the terminus point, not Beijing. Right? Singapore to Scotland is actually the title of my essay. It is actually the furthest distance you can conceivably travel on Earth by train and either never get off the train or at least do it on one track. And that could come true. You could actually go from Edinburgh, Scotland to Singapore by train. Australian backpackers is the kind of thing that they would normally do, but it could make sense as a business trip even now, one day. The point is, Asian high-speed rail, Singapore as a rail terminus makes one think of Singapore not just, of course, as a maritime, as a port, as of course one of the largest and busiest ports in the entire world, but also, therefore, leveraging the massive land-based infrastructure investment that's going on to be this sort of gateway to sort of obviously heavily populous growing ASEAN markets and so on. And then there's also obviously Singapore as a maritime hub, and Singapore's ability role model in a way as a very efficient port alongside other places like Jebel Ali, Rotterdam, and so forth. To me, sort of revive these visions of a medieval Hanseatic League, right? Port cities that collaborated in trade, that had unique customs arrangements with each other to ensure efficiency of cargo, even forming, although this is a stretch for the 21st century, but that they did in the 13th century even form military alliances with each other. But of course, no one in this room needs to be educated about the strategic role of the Straits of Malacca and Singapore's positioning therein. But of course, what I'm highlighting here is this maritime Silk Road, as people call it, between the high growth markets of the Middle East and those of the Far East, and Singapore's strategic positioning there. Point being, situating Singapore, not just maritime, also land-based, very strategic geography in more ways than people may have traditionally realized. Now, that's the territorial. What about this notion of info state? What is an info state? Well, where does Singapore stand in an